Wonderful. So I think next up we have Lucy. Yeah, we'll kind of just go straight over to your section if you want to. Right, and is it all set up?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Brilliant.
How long have we got? I know we're tight
on
time.
Well, what's going to happen is that clock is going to count down, and when it gets to 0, you need to stop talking. So it'll give you a sense of, and then there's a bit of extra time for questions at the end. But so that's your time. Okay. If you can finish earlier, great. Okay,
I'll do my best.
So continuing on this sort of like theme of digital transformation. Yeah. Our next speaker is Lucy Küng. She's the Google News Research Fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. She's also visiting professor of media innovation at the University of Oslo and non-exec director at a Swiss public broadcaster. And she's going to share her thoughts on the strategic roadmap for operational transformation based on a number of interviews with large media organisations. So, Lucy, over to you.
Okay, lovely to be here. And just to warn, I have been massively promoted here. I am not a CEO of the Google Digital News Initiative, just to correct that now. I'm the Google Digital News Senior Fellow at the Reuters Institute, Oxford. And what I decided to do with my research is really look at what best practice digital transformation looks like for legacy companies, who is getting it right, and what are they actually doing? We kind of know which companies are ahead of the game, but I really wanted to understand what is it they're doing right. So in fact, what I've been looking at is the least sexy, most boring part of this transformation, which is not the content transformation, but how the organizations are changing. Just really quickly, this research builds directly on 3 others. The first, the dark blue one, I spoke to about 40 CEOs, board chairs, said, looking back over the last 15 years, what would you have done differently? What did they think they did wrong? The next blue one, which came out in this book, Innovators in Digital News, some of you may read, I looked at 5 players doing well with digital news and tried to understand how they functioned as organizations. And the green one at the bottom was a piece of, really an update of this stripy book I did, which is a text on strategy applied to the media. That book came out in 2007, first edition. Within 6 months, we had Facebook and we had the iPhone, and 30% of it, increasing to 70% of it, went out of date really, really fast. So I updated that last year, which forced me to look really profoundly at what's happening in the media during that period. And actually, there was one story in terms of the revision to that green book, and that's the ascendancy of technology inside the media. That's really the big story, I think. So moving on to the work I'm doing now, the basic premise I started with is we are now 2 decades into the internet. New media is no longer new. We have a large percentage of people inside our organizations, maybe in the periphery, maybe at the bottom, for whom email is actually a pretty antiquated communication tool. So what that means for us trying to understand how organizations function is that we kind of know the strategic framework we're dealing with. And I think we can begin to fine-tune, and we can begin to move out of this frantic, frenetic, everything's changing, what the hell do we do, and start to be more rigorous and more strategic, and actually use the leverage, I think, that a lot of legacy players are leaving on the table. And a lot of that leverage is organizational. 2 things about the kind of situation we're coming from, one concerning the inside organization, one concerning the strategic environment. The first is actually complexity. If you look at where the mass media have come from, the 1950s and 60s, we had really, really simple mass media products, national TV channels, national newspapers, something for everyone. General interest products. 1980s, we added, thanks to technology, by the way, cable and satellite, new printing technologies, we added on the niche layer. We got niche TV channels. Newspapers expanded with all of their niche supplements, niche magazines. 1996 onwards, legacy media added on website, on demand, so the digital online layer went on. 2008, social mobile layer. Now, what that means for legacy media organizations is essentially complexity. What we are having to do is arbitrage, resources, management attention, new products, innovation across all of these existing and new parts of our businesses. And if we think about the really strong digital players we're competing against now, so the BuzzFeeds or the Vices or the Voxes, the refineries, they've absolutely got the luxury of focus. They're normally, especially the ones that are venture capital, private equity backed, have massive resources, financial resources, and they've got the luxury of focus. So what that means for the audience is an amazing increase in choice in what they consume, how they consume, et cetera, et cetera. But for us as organizations, fragmentation and more complexity, enormously more complexity and stretched resources. And the other story in terms of the external environment is, of course, the platforms. I think this is the big story. This is actually old data. It's only got worse. I think what that means for us is, to use a noun from the Brexit debate, is loss of sovereignty. You know, we're losing, we have no scale, or scale has actually been redefined. Scale is now what Instagram or Facebook have. We're losing control of distribution. We're losing control of the context in which our content is created, the data, the relationship with the audiences, less and less in control of our destiny. And we are beginning to see collective moves against that. We're beginning to see collective action to try and increase the balance of power. But frankly, the balance of power is so asymmetrical. There's only so far that's going to go. And then just one of my favorite quotes from the CEO research I did, I asked all of them, what was the biggest mistake? What keeps you up at night? You know, what, looking back at the last 15 years, would you have done differently? And I got, in about 2/3 of the cases, the same variance of the same answer, which was essentially our worst case scenario wasn't bad enough. You know, we thought we were going to be messed up. We had no idea of the kind of profundity, the size of the earthquake that was going to be facing us. Okay, that's the environment. So my core thesis that I've used as a basis for this work, that is being published. It will be free on the Reuters Institute website at the end of November. It's a report of about 15,000 words, and then there'll be a kind of self-diagnostic tool coming later. This is my core thesis, and I think actually all of us, even really, really committed content creators and passionate journalists, we need to start putting as much emphasis on transforming our organizations as we put into transforming our storytelling. Okay, this slide actually boils down all of that book into one slide. And these were the kind of 7 elements that these organizations, and that was Vice, BuzzFeed, New York Times, Guardian, and Quartz, trying to analyze what did they do that was similar. The 3 dark ones in the middle, Kathleen was talking some of those earlier, they're kind of classic to high-performing organizations anywhere. Very clear strategy, very smart leader, very strong sense of purpose. But the 2 pale blue ones were the ones that I think are very specific to the media industry. And the story there is, firstly, an increasing merging of technology, journalism, and commercial factors inside the organization, at individual level in some cases, and a pro-digital culture. Organizations that weren't nostalgic about culture, about the past, that didn't wish you could wake up one morning and the internet would never be invented and they could go back to being proper journalists or proper book editors or proper music producers. People who actually saw the whole digital environment as a tremendously exciting opportunity. And this is really what I started to look at. So what I've been looking at in this research is how these 2 issues play together, how tech is coming into the kind of central nervous system of media organizations, how on earth you build cultures that are proactive, and then this kind of collection of smaller factors above. The big surprise to me, which I never expected to end up spending so much time on, this is the subject that is really the most boring to everyone in the media, is how important HR is, how important your leadership is, how important your learning is, how you approach your learning, how important your recruitment is, how important your ability to deal with people that are not coming along fast enough. This is actually all really, really critical. So let's dive into a few of the results. And as I said, the whole report is available quite soon. Essentially, what emerged, and we've heard a lot of that today, is that the world has been so volatile that long-term strategy has essentially been abdicated. It's still done because it's the basis of planning. It's the basis of mid-long-term forecasting. But essentially, when I ask people what strategy's been like, I've come up with these kinds of answers. Opportunistic, constant firefighting, retrofitted, didn't feel like a strategy at the time, and the famous rebuilding the aeroplane in mid-flight. Now, that's really, really dangerous because the big disruptors, be they the platforms or be they the VC-backed digital pure plays, have very, very smart strategies. They know what they're trying to do, and they're prepared to pivot and shift till they get there. So this is kind of opening up a front. I think the challenge here is disentangling all of the various strategic forces into a kind of clear model of what it is we need to be doing. And what's emerging from this research is at the top, you have the really long-term strategic goals. Why does this organization exist? This is where the kind of journalistic mission is enshrined. Under that, the second layer of strategy is the whole area of business model, which is really, really the most challenging issue at the moment. The top is self-evident. You ask anyone in a media organization, and people basically know what it is they're trying to do. And that can be refined, that can be pulled out. This is a real mess. And there's a lot of kind of lemming-like behavior. What's coming in here is a puzzle of different revenue streams. In between that come all the shiny new things that have been diverting strategic attention in recent years. And what I'm seeing in the stronger players against the weaker players is a really, really rigorous analytical approach to these shiny new things. And they are assessed in terms of how do they help us meet our goals, and how the hell are we going to finance them? How do they help us finance our goals? Tech and data is the kind of central nervous system that sits behind all of this. So that's really the fourth layer of the strategy. So pulling this together, this needs absolute consistency. This is the core mission of the company. This is the toughest and nastiest challenge. And I would argue that a lot of this is the really core challenge for people in CEO roles, I think, at the moment. This is where, in a way, we're moving away from the digital visionary role, and we're saying we need really tough-minded people who can solve this challenge. And what we also need to prevent attention being hijacked and focus lost is a really, really clear process and criteria for handling shiny new things. So this is clearly value creation, and this is where you capture value. Now, the pivot, a lot of the people I've spoken to have talked an awful lot about we want to be able to pivot. And having looked at this really hard, I think pivoting is really a concept from Silicon Valley. I'm still searching for an example of a media company that has executed a pivot as a digital pure play has. And my argument is essentially, I think pivoting is perhaps a Silicon Valley VC concept. What we're looking for is the ability to be agile and the ability to pull off fast, neat, conclusive strategic shifts. And what I've been looking at is what are the building blocks that need to be in place for that to happen? You get a big shift in the environment, whatever it is, Facebook, instant articles, AR, VR, whatever. How can you build an organization that can pick up on those movements? The first comes down to leadership. You need tremendously clear leadership. Someone who's worked out, okay, this has happened, this is what it means, and can signal to the organization, this is where we're going now. That can only work if in advance you've made the culture ready, you've made the culture plastic. So this is something you need to have in place before. You can't start trying to change the culture once the pivot need is there. And what I'm seeing really clearly in the stronger players I'm talking to now, and the companies I've been talking to, Axel Springer, Schibsted, Washington Post, New York Times, Economist, Mike, Vox, and many, many others, is a lot of them have worked very hard to build a kind of cultural plasticity in advance. Even really established legacy organizations building an expectation of from now on we're going to keep shifting relatively often. And the last is a kind of degree of strategical flexibility, and that is coming down to building a cross-functional, multidisciplinary team as a kind of default organizational module inside the organization. Project-based work, working with people, combining people with different skills and different backgrounds. And there's there are additional processes we're seeing in there, very smart use of fellowships, internships, and so on. Quickly onto culture. There's two big cultural issues, I think. The first is the basic challenge communicating to the entire organization that leadership in one technology era does not automatically translate to leadership in the next. And that's something that often you get pockets of realization inside the organization. Quite often members of the board have it, people on the marketing front have it, but there can be a kind of hard-edged kernel inside the organization that assumes we've always been a leader, we will be a leader on these new platforms too, and that's no longer automatic. The second big challenge, which we're going to look at a bit now, is merging the cultures of editorial and engineering. And what I've found is there are actually differences in these cultures, but there is actually overlap as well, and those overlaps give you the basis for, they give you the leverage to change the culture, to shift the culture. So for the dark blue circle here is classic media, and this one over here is the technology culture. So these are the two cultures coming together. If you look at the root discipline, what these people studied, people in the media tend to have come up through the liberal arts, people in tech have come up through engineering, computer science, and so on. So big difference there. In terms of what they think they're trying to do, their mission in life, classic media, it's about serving audiences, shaping public opinion, they want their voice to be heard. In tech area, it's often about perfecting UX, making the best possible experience for users. Classic media tend to be risk averse, and of course I don't mean war journalists, I don't mean investigative journalists and so on. What I'm saying is that historically this is an industry, because of the old technology, that meant you had to get a product nearly perfect before you press the button to broadcast or publish, which meant there was this huge pressure to make things perfect. Whereas in technology, everything is really an experiment. You're permanently iterating, permanently doing. So these are kind of areas of difference. One other big difference is classic media has always had a really strong commitment to, protecting vulnerable public values. But the areas of overlap here, firstly, both cultures really respect clarity of thought, clarity of language. It can be a beautifully turned phrase, a beautiful headline, or for an engineer, a beautiful line of code. So there's a huge area of commonality there. Both cultures have a huge commitment to their craft, and both are very, very highly intrinsically motivated. So there are big leverage here that leaders at all levels can work with. The really interesting one is here, and we're seeing this, I think, hit very much with the problems Facebook and Uber are facing right now. These are not, the technology industry has not had a heritage, a history of social responsibility, of protecting vulnerable values. So, key takeaways from my research so far, just a few headlines. Firstly, in terms of borrowing concepts from Silicon Valley, there are a number that are really, really valuable. The emphasis they place on curating a culture, on building a culture. So a culture is not an automatic obstacle, it's your biggest lever for performance, for example. But I think there's a lot of elements from Silicon Valley that are being imported without thinking about them, and they don't really fit that well. Secondly, the big challenge, I think, is balancing the need to be agile against the need to have a really serious long-term strategy, a game plan. We need to think a bit more like VCs. If we wanted a serious, substantial, solid exit in 7 years, what do we need to put in place now? And I think, therefore, we need to somehow, with the strategy processes, create an inbuilt expectation of iteration and testing and revision, and everyone in the organization needs to understand that. Resources are very, very stretched, and whenever I talk to people in the media and say, are there bits of your business that actually you could drop tomorrow and no one would notice that are eating resources, people always nod. And I think what is needed is, because of this resource overstretch, because of the complexity, we need to get really very rigorous about exiting parts of the business that are no longer necessary because of this need to focus more. And I think this is also something where one needs to train the culture so that closing down an operation or a project isn't seen as a kind of nuclear development that freaks everyone out. You need to kind of develop an expectation that essentially the policy of this organization is shifting resources towards areas that are more promising and more sustainable, and needs to be done in a disciplined way. From an HR perspective, from a cultural perspective, one of the big opportunities at the moment is organizations are, in a technical term, unfrozen. You will never have cultures more open to changing, doing things differently, embracing new ways than you have at the moment. So for all of you as leaders, you've got really plastic organizations at the moment, so this is the time to push through the changes you want. I think there's huge leverage potential in HR. The companies I'm talking to, for example, when it comes to recruitment, it's not just the HR people doing the recruitment or the direct boss. They're involving a lot of people in the organization in assessing that person. They're redesigning roles. They're embedding people. So I think that area, which no one is really very keen on, and when I talk to some people about HR, literally eyes roll, lips curl, but it is something that needs to be looked at. And finally, if one looks at the sheer caliber of people working in the media industry, their education, their commitment, their motivation, that is probably the biggest area for leverage that's not being used. And the leading companies I've been talking to are really pushing responsibility for transformation down to smart individuals inside the organization. We all know that consultants don't do too well in the media industry. The closer they get to content, the less they are accepted. But actually, you have an enormous potential for transforming your organizations in terms of the very smart individuals working in there, and you need to use them more. Okay, that's it from me. So
fascinating. I mean, you know, lots and lots. So thank you very much. Two things that sort of really resonated with me was, one is the importance of HR and people and culture and getting the culture right before you try and do something big and dramatic. And I guess the other thing was just understanding the difference between the Silicon Valley engineering culture, which we all think that's what we want, and the editorial culture, and recognizing it, you can't import everything wholesale. So I think that's really sort of thought-provoking. I don't know whether the green box is over there. Are there any questions from the floor? We've got a little bit of time for questions. Or are you just shell-shocked by the... We've got a question over here. So, Karen, can I just chuck you the green box? Or somebody chuck him the green box. Karen, there you go. Thank you.
Hi, Rosie. A fascinating speech. The aspect of looking after society for classic media versus technology, I was fascinated by that. Do you think that's something that can change? I mean, do you think as these businesses go on to become legacies in their own right, they'll grow a conscience? Or,
I think that's what they're being required to do by the regulators, and by saying we're a platform, we're not content creating. What they're desperately trying to do is not drawn into the sphere, because that aspect is where the regulation comes in, which they desperately don't want to be. But I think what we're seeing, I think we've seen it with Google, and I think we're beginning to see it with Facebook, an acknowledgement, actually we are essentially somewhere in the content industries, and we have the same influence on democratic values, societal values, and actually we're going to have to be regulated in some, I mean, that's a huge area, but yeah.
Any more questions? One over here. Quite a long shot, but I'm sure you'll make it.
Hey.
No, you won't. Okay. Hannah.
Yeah, thanks. That was really, really great. It's Hannah.
Hi, Hannah.
You talked a little bit about how it would be great sometimes with older media organisations if they could sunset projects that aren't working quickly. Have you seen any examples of that working really well and how that was managed? Because I have found that sometimes really old habits are hard to break, even if people will happily admit that there are certain projects that they could divert resources elsewhere.
Yeah, I guess two big comments there. Firstly, from the CEOs I spoke to, that was one of their biggest wish. Just that and they seem to be collectively dodging the issue a lot. What I have seen is that the first one is very, very painful. if there's unions involved or regulators or whatever, it can be a really, really nasty experience, but you set a precedent. So I think it's almost it's the kind of negative equivalent of a quick win. You need to do it once, actually almost for symbolic value. But it really is astounding, even in the middle of organizations, if you talk, anyone could come up a list with 3 bits of the business you could drop tomorrow. So it's somehow, I think, having that conversation, but it's an area people don't want to go into. I mean, even if you look at the design of an MBA course, there is never, ever a module on cost cutting, which is, arguably the one thing that every executive at some point in their life is going to have to deal with. So I think it's an issue where almost it's part of being kind of responsible and grown up about this. I think we have to start the conversation and do it in a disciplined and a transparent way. I mean, this issue of letting go of people also came up. I mean, during the previous 2 research, interestingly, the assumption there was that you can bring everyone along. And that seems to finally be shifting, and there seems to be a kind of sense developing that there will always be a kind of kernel of people that are not prepared to make the shift and will always be complaining, and essentially the answer is to be completely transparent, but also be transparent about if you're not prepared to go on the journey, then we need to part companies. So I think, in terms of, it comes up to leadership, and what was very clear in this research is it's shifted, the leadership role is shifting from this kind of digital visionary to being, it's really kind of getting quite hard-nosed operational, and especially this issue of revenues, I think, which is really the big issue.
That thing about sort of like where is the money coming from? And I think it was a good point about being quite hard-nosed with the shiny new things.
Yes.
And sort of saying, no, can we make money out of it, and does it actually suit our goals?
It's
and just desisting from
It's really astounding how
fashion.
Some very, very wealthy companies are still saying, if I can't find someone to underwrite my experiment in AR, we're not doing it. So they're very, very disciplined, even when actually they have the resources to do it.
Yes, yeah. I think we're out of time, so thank you very much. One question, your report, you say it's going to be available on the
it's
website.
Coming out on the Reuters website, I think 25th or 26th of November.
Okay, we'll all be waiting. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And so we're going to break for lunch, and then we're hopefully going to catch up. So if you could be back here at 2 for a start at 2:05 this afternoon, and we'll catch up the time. Thank you. Wonderful, thank you.